What happens when a world champion feels betrayed by his own team? Hamilton requested help on the radio. Vasseur contradicted him publicly without filters. And the SF-25 became inconducible in one of the most tense moments of the year. But is it just a bad classification? Or are we facing a crash of trains between two titans with opposite visions? Baku has historically become a circuit where the unexpected can happen. Narrow streets, long straight, violent braking and unstable climatic conditions make this urban layout one of the most challenging calendar. However, what happened in the classification of the Azerbaijan 2025 Grand Prix exceeded any expectation. And not because chaos was new, but because of the way it directly affected one of the most important names of paddock, Lewis Hamilton. From Friday's free practices, Ferrari seemed to have found the lost course. Lewis led the timetable in the FP1, sending a clear message that it could finally be in a position to fight for pole in a scenario where the rebufo, the control of the traffic and the reading of the temperature windows are key. The SF-25 was stable in braking and aggressive in slow curves. But all that disappeared when the clock began to run on Saturday. The classification session was simply brutal. 6 red flags in total, a figure that matches an absolute record, created an environment where improvisation replaced the strategy. Teams like McLaren and Mercedes adjusted their decisions on the march, but in Ferrari things began to fall apart. In the midst of that chaos, Hamilton was trapped in a circuit that does not forgive reading errors. Its soft tires did not reach the optimal temperature, and the rear balance of the car disappeared completely. Each curve was a fight against a car that seemed to want to spit the pilot in each slow curve outlet. The most revealing image was not an onboard camera. It was his radio desperate and direct message: "I'm struggling with the rear. Any advice? Please give me a hand." It wasn't just a complaint about balance. It was a direct request for help, of support, of connection. The phrase distilled frustration but also a feeling of abandonment. What should have been a strategic exchange became a cry for communication. There was no clarity in tire management, and the result was a critical difference in performance. The most obvious error came in the choice of compounds. While teams like Red Bull and Mercedes focused on the middle tire, Ferrari chose to get Hamilton with the soft. In a circuit like Baku, where the temperature window changes rapidly with every minute, this decision condemned it. It did not generate the necessary load, there was no grip on the rear axle and could not find rhythm. The time he marked was surpassed by his own partner, Charles Leclerc, at a time that symbolizes the biggest internal problems. When the second driver of the team eliminates the first without having made an obvious error of piloting. Hamilton was sincere after getting out of the car. He assured that the average tire choice was denied by a planning error in the second free practice. When losing a crucial game, its strategy was limited. It wasn't an excuse. It was a technical explanation. But it was also an evening accusation. The planning had failed. The team did not anticipate Saturday's chaos. They did not prepare a plan B, and the pilot was at the mercy of an unpredictable car. This moment is not only important for sports. It is symbolic. He talks about a disconnection between Hamilton and his team of engineers. In a sport where every thousandth depends on the harmony between man and machine, this tactical divorce can be more dangerous than any performance difference. When a pilot like Hamilton with 7 titles and 20 years of experience begins to doubt his team, the entire project enters into a critical zone. Trust is more difficult to recover than the rhythm. Baku was the first visible crack in a marriage that, on paper, seemed to success. But in practice, he showed signs of deep uncoordination. A team that failed to react in real time. A car that did not respond as expected. And a pilot who not only asked for performance but support. Baku's collapse was technical, strategic, and emotional. After the elimination of Hamilton in the Q2 in Baku, the media soon looking for reactions. It was inevitable. A heptacampion of the world outside the top 10 while his partner advances to Q3 with the same car is a narrative too juicy to let. But what nobody expected was the hardness with which Vasseur decided to respond to his pilot's criticism. Lewis had explained that he was forced to run with soft tires because he lost a media game in the second practice. In his opinion, he put him at a disadvantage in front of the rest. A technical criticism, but clear. A questioning of equipment planning. However, Vasseur responded with coldness and surgical precision. "We aborted lap 1. You're not fueling the car for 10 laps. We need to push." At the end, the pole was with softs. The first thing to understand is that this phrase directly contradicts Hamilton's justification. Not just denies it, disavowing it publicly. In other words, the team leader tells the world that the pilot was wrong. That did not completely understand the logic behind the strategy. That the car was prepared to attack with soft because, according to the data, it was the appropriate compound. This statement has a devastating impact, not only for its technical content, but for what it represents in terms of internal dynamics. In Ferrari, the relationship between pilot and direction has been historically volatile. From the days of Prost to the most tense moments with Vettel, the team has had chronic problems to balance internal hierarchy and political management. But with Hamilton, the expectation was different. His arrival was sold as the beginning of a new era, an alliance of champions, a professional and mature environment. What was seen in Baku was the opposite, a crossing of versions that undressed an internal fracture in broad daylight. Vasseur continued his technical defense with a phrase that seemed to minimize the drama, but that only deepened the uncertainty. "I think everybody is in the same sit-on. The tires? It's a bit of a confusion for everybody." The choice of words is revealing. He doesn't say Ferrari made a mistake. He doesn't say they could have done something different. He says that confusion was general, that the problem was in the nature of the session. An indirect way of diluting responsibility without assuming it at all. However, the true earthquake came with an admission that no team leader does without a very clear purpose. In a later interview, Vasseur released the phrase that redefined the entire narrative: "Lewis and I, we collectively, probably underestimated the change of environment." Here it is no longer about defending the strategy. It is about recognizing a structural failure in the integration of Hamilton to Ferrari. It is about saying, with careful words, that they were not prepared to adapt to someone who came from being 2 decades in a different environment. That recognition is not less. It is a tacit confession that the adaptation process has been much more complex than what was projected publicly. That Ferrari failed to understand or prepare the technical, human, and emotional ecosystem that Hamilton needs to perform. And even more, that Lewis himself underestimated the size of the adjustment that Mercedes meant to Maranello. In practice, these statements are a depth bomb. They say much more than they appear. They reflect that the team is not only struggling with track performance problems, but with a more subtle but equally destructive conflict: the disconnection between sports management and its main asset. What happened in Baku was not simply an anecdote or an isolated stumble. It was the accumulation of signals that had been managed from the preseason tests. And now, after just 3 played races, the narrative around Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari has changed completely. What began as a story of redemption, an icon of Formula One by joining forces with the most legendary brand of sport, is beginning to seem like a case of non-fulfilling expectations, frustrated adaptation, and a technical divorce that could explode before the championship ends. Vasseur's recognition that underestimated the transition is not trivial. He admits, in essence, that Ferrari did not prepare the land properly to integrate his new leader. And even more, that Hamilton has failed to adapt to the rhythm of change that requires a team such as Ferrari, marked by decades of traditions, internal tensions, and national expectations. It is not the same to run for a company like Mercedes with a Germanic corporate mentality than to do it for an institution like Ferrari, where each movement has a symbolic and historical burden. In addition, in the technical, Ferrari has not taken forceful steps to facilitate that transition. The SF25 is still a capricious car, with a very limited performance window. A car that demands an extremely specific type of pilot and that does not forgive errors or driving or setup. While Leclerc has learned to live with these limitations because it has been within the same project for years, Hamilton is still in an exploration phase. And that adaptation time, in a season as compressed and competitive as 2025, can become a conviction. The future of this pair today more than ever hangs from a thread. A thread that can break not with a scandal, but with the progressive silence of lost trust. And in Formula One, when that happens, there is no turning back. The classification of the Azerbaijan 2025 prize was not only a disappointing Saturday for Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton, it was a turning point. An episode that, with the passing of the days, is becoming a metaphor for something deeper. The structural imbalance between what was promised at the beginning of the season and the reality that the team faces a career after career. And while these types of situations are not unusual in Formula One, what differentiates this case is the magnitude of the characters involved and the implications it could have for the championship. What we saw in Baku was more than a tactical error. It was a cultural crack. A difference in approach, communication, and expectations. Ferrari and Hamilton are in the midst of a relationship that has not yet defined their internal rules. Who makes key decisions? How much autonomy does the pilot have in strategic planning? Are they listening to each other? And most importantly, is there a common project or just a temporary coexistence? Therefore, I want to know your opinion. Do you think Hamilton is right to feel frustrated by Ferrari's management in Baku? Or do you think that Vasseur did well to make it clear that decisions are made based on data, not individual perceptions? Is this alliance a time bomb, or a redemption story that is yet to be written? Leave it in the comments.